Hi and welcome to Michael's Musings on Music. Today I want to talk about the percussion section of the orchestra. They might be the most fun to watch at a concert because each player often plays many different percussion instruments and sometimes in quick succession, so you'll see them rushing back and forth to cover all the instruments. They're also one of the most crucial sections in an orchestra. A strong percussion section allows everyone in the orchestra to lock into their sound and rhythm, sometimes even leading the orchestra. So let's talk about some of the instruments in a percussion section. I want to start with the timpani, or the kettle drums, because they look like upside down kettles. The timpani, in fact, of all the percussion instruments, has its own dedicated player, the timpanist. And this is partly due to the important musical role that the timpani plays in the orchestra. So the timpani can play specific pitches, and you tune a timpani by pressing on a foot pedal that tightens or loosens the head, which is the part of the drum that stretches over the top, in order to produce certain pitches. Now this head can be made usually of plastic, but sometimes it can be made of animal skin, which some timpanists actually prefer because it's a better quality sound. But they're also much more temperamental when it comes to atmospheric conditions in the hall and all that. So you tune the timpani by pressing down the pedals. Then there's a gauge at the side of the timpani that is a rough check on what note you're on. But it's only an approximation. You need to fine tune that note. And if you ever look closely at a concert, you'll see sometimes the timpanist bending down very close to the head of the drum and tapping on it. That's them listening to make sure that the note is exactly in tune. And sometimes they're doing this when the entire orchestra is playing really loudly. So a timpanist has to have very sensitive hearing in order to bring the drum into pitch. So a timpanist has a variety of sticks, or what we call mallets, that they can use, from soft to hard and everything in between. That really alters how the instrument sounds. The beaters are usually made of wood covered by felt or cloth. So what the timpani maybe is best known for is a roll, a timpani roll, which is where the timpanist with the two mallets alternate back and forth very, very quickly, which is quite a dramatic effect, especially as they get louder. Now the bass drum can produce some of the loudest sounds in the orchestra for sure, but also some of the most subtle and soft effects. And this is determined by what kind of mallet they would use, where on the bass drum they play, and of course how hard they play it. So where the bass drum is, the cymbals can't be far behind. The percussionists will take a pair of cymbals, one in each hand, and clash them together by a passing movement, never directly together, or else it chokes the sound. Then they can be held aloft, where they will continue to ring for a considerable amount of time. They don't always play loud. Sometimes a quiet sound can be achieved by rubbing the edges of the cymbals together very closely. Also, you can have one cymbal that's mounted on a stand that you strike with a mallet or a stick or a wire brush. Now, a roll, we talked about the roll in the timpani. The same principle applies sometimes on a suspended cymbal. If you use soft mallets and roll on a suspended cymbal, this produces the most wonderful sound that can wash over the entire orchestra. So just remember, it's the timpani's job is to roll you towards the climax, and the cymbal's job is to let you know that you've arrived. Now, what gives the snare drum its distinctive sound is the snares, which is a length of wire stretched tightly across the bottom of the drum. Now, as the drum vibrates as you play it, the snares vibrate, and that gives you that characteristic sound. Now, there's a lever on the side of the drum that you can engage that actually disengages the snares, so it just becomes like a normal drum, kind of a hollow sound. Now, it's played, of course, with drumsticks, sometimes with wire brushes, and sometimes you can actually play the snare drum just on the rim of the instrument. It's a versatile and expressive instrument due to its sensitivity and responsiveness to even the lightest strokes. The triangle, when you look it up close, is not attached all the way around. There's always one corner where the sides don't join, and that allows the instrument to vibrate. It's also hung from a string for the same reason, and you tap it with a metal beater that produces this silvery sound. Now, it can also do a roll where the beater goes back and forth between the two sides. which gives this incredible vibrancy, especially in these loud orchestral sounds. The tambourine has a drum head and small circular metal discs, appropriately called jangles, that are attached around the edge, capable of many different effects, both delicate and subtle and loud. There are some actually advanced techniques that are very difficult to master. So for example, back to this idea of a roll, one way of doing a tambourine roll is called a thumb roll. And what the percussionist will do is wet their thumb and push it along the tambourine head. And that friction makes the jangles vibrate with a very intense sound. Next we have the Tam Tam, not to be confused with the gong. A gong is a pitched instrument that has a knob in the center and is not that often heard in orchestral repertoire. A Tam Tam is a large, impressive, hanging, hammered bronze disc at the back of the percussion section. It produces no distinct pitch, but instead produces this resonant, echoing sound, very booming and very majestic. The castanets in an orchestral setting are played differently than you might imagine. You can imagine a flamenco dancer with the two castanets, one in each hand. The percussion players play it a little differently. They have the two castanets mounted on a flat surface, and they are played by tapping them with their fingers or the palm of their hands. The whip is not a real whip, to the disappointment of some people. To get the sound of the whip, a percussionist will use a slapstick, and this consists of two wooden boards joined together by a hinge at one end. Now, the most famous example of the whip in orchestral repertoire, I think, is Leroy Anderson's Sleigh Ride. Now, the ratchet consists of a wooden cog and some slats, and you turn the handle, just like you would imagine with a ratchet, and you cause the teeth of the cog to turn against the slats, which creates this clicking sound. And sometimes if you wind it very fast, the clicks come very close together, producing a very cacophonous sort of sound. So these are the unpitched instruments of the percussion section. They really fall into two categories. We have the unpitched. Now, timpani, of course, is pitched, but everything else is unpitched. Now I want to talk about the pitched instruments of the percussion section, and that is the xylophone, the vibraphone, the marimba, the Glockenspiel. These are all have notes arranged like a piano keyboard. The xylophone, of course, has bars made of wood, and they result in a very bright and very penetrating timbre. The thing about the xylophone is that it has very little resonance, which means that fast passage work will sound crystal clear. And you can use many different types of mallets with a head made of yarn, hard plastic, hard rubber, wood even. And also what they do, if the music demands that they play more than two notes at a time, what a percussion player can do is put two mallets in each hand, and that results in them playing actually four notes at the same time. The vibraphone refers to the instrument's vibrating sound. It looks a lot like a xylophone, except the bars are made out of a metal alloy instead of wood. And here's the thing. It has resonating tubes that go underneath each bar, and inside each of these tubes is a fan disc that's attached to a motor. It kind of goes around like that. And this produces a very distinctive vibrating sound. Then there's the marimba, whose sound is much deeper, much more mellow, more resonant than the xylophone. It has certainly a musical flavor reminiscent of African or Caribbean music. The Glockenspiel is the smallest of the pitched instruments, and it has little metal bars, about this big, the instrument, and it produces a silvery and bright tone. And when it's played strongly, when it's played loudly, it can carry over the entire orchestra. Next we have chimes, or sometimes called tubular bells, very high up here, just hanging bells. And it really tries to mimic the sound of church bells, and it's played by a hammer. The mallet's an actual hammer that you strike. And this is nowhere near an exhaustive list of all the percussion instruments that a percussionist has to play. Now, each percussionist will have their very own set of many different mallets and sticks that they feel comfortable with, and they carry around with them in a stick bag. Now, a great percussion section, as I mentioned before, the orchestra can really latch onto, but also they need to have a lot of imagination as a section, because they have the dual job of playing very rhythmic, very vertical playing, but also being responsible for the color and the effects of the music as well. Next week, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of the conductor.